Now, Lindsey Graham often used his access to President Trump to shape U.S. policy in ways that few others could. Lawmakers from both parties say that made Graham uniquely influential on issues like Ukraine, Iran, and Russia sanctions. Republicans are grappling with the fact that there will be no replacing Graham. You just heard that from Lauren as well. When it comes to foreign policy, or as key here, a conduit to President Trump. Michael Froman is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. He served as U.S. Trade Representative under President Obama as well, and he joins us now from Washington. I am wondering how you're reflecting on this afternoon, especially given where American foreign policy is now, because even allies are questioning U.S. values and the country's commitment to decades of that American doctrine. And I'm wondering, the senator saw all of this happening before his eyes, before his death. He was very clear-eyed about America's enemies, but also about the challenges about this new Trump doctrine.
Well, that's right. And I think while he was very close to President Trump, he did, as you say, try to influence him in a positive direction, whether it was support for Ukraine or international engagement more generally. He was also, of course, a very strong supporter of the attacks on Iran as well. He was, in many respects, a bridge between the two leaders who are here today, Netanyahu and Zelensky, and Trump, in helping to build those relationships with them over the course of the last several years, and very much had a sense of the importance of U.S. engagement with the world, of alliances. He was always a strong presence, for example, at the Munich Security Conference, reassuring our European allies of the commitment of the United States to European security. And he'll be missed for his positive influence on the president in that regard.
Yeah, it will be quite a void. On Ukraine specifically, he was unable to persuade the president that the U.S. should go all in on Ukrainian support. I know things may have changed in the last few weeks, but this was the MAGA base, right? It likely remains unconvinced as well. You only have to look at that humiliating scene in the Oval Office last year. Graham did not come to Zelensky's defense, at least not publicly. We have heard that perhaps he did so behind the scenes. I'm wondering what that says in terms of the compromises that he knew had to be made, and did he have, much more, let's say, optimism for Ukraine in his last few days? He had just been there. It was his last foreign trip.
That's right. And I think over the course of the last several months, Ukraine has proven itself to be not only resilient in the face of Russia's attack, but to be able to go on the offensive, engage in deep strikes into Russian territory, push back on some territory that the Russians had occupied in Ukraine, and demonstrate to the president that they can be a winner. And the president likes winners. And so I think Senator Graham, perhaps behind the scenes, played a role in seeing that evolution from that terrible Oval Office meeting that you referred to the really quite warm embrace that Zelensky got today, and most recently at the NATO summit as well. And so there's been a great evolution in that regard. Kind of the opposite evolution with regard to Netanyahu, who, of course, the president was very close to, very supportive of, and where that relationship is now quite strained.
When it comes, though, to foreign policy and trying to convince the president, President Trump, that alliances are beneficial, that's not the tack that he's taken in Iran. Is it true, do you believe, that the senator is irreplaceable? And that really perhaps has more to do with Republican politics, with MAGA politics, than it has to do with Senator Graham?
I think within the Republican caucus, there are still a number of senators and members of the House who are very much committed to the NATO alliance, very supportive of Ukraine, and are doing what they can to influence the administration and to reassure our allies there and around the world that the U.S. remains very much committed to their security. As you said, there's had to be compromise given where the president and the administration has been, and this arrangement by which the U.S. sells weapons to Europe. Europe uses the frozen assets, the frozen Russian assets, to the interest on it to help buy those weapons and then provide them to Ukraine, is a clever workaround for U.S. support for Ukraine rather than going directly to Congress for a very significant arms package. And the U.S. is still very much involved in Ukraine and providing intelligence support and other forms of support that only the U.S. can provide.
And if I ask you a question, linking the senator's thinking on this, because he was trying to get that package of sanctions against Russia through both houses, where do you think that goes from here? And was he convinced that it would make a difference? Because, as has been pointed out by you many times, sometimes the sanctions are not as effective as many think they will be.
Well, yes, it's very unclear. I mean, there's been several sanctions packages against Russians, individual Russians, Russian entities, and yet Russia's continued to manage its economy. It's under a lot of strain, although some of that strain is being alleviated, ironically, by the increase in oil prices caused by the closing of the Strait of Hormuz and the U.S. engagement with and the U.S. conflict with Iran. So right now, Russia is actually benefiting from our war with Iran in terms of higher oil prices, helping to subsidize their wartime economy. I think this latest sanctions package, which the senator felt very strongly about, the Senate's going to vote on later today. There is momentum behind it. There are some difficult issues, including provisions that give the president more tariff authority, which Democrats are reluctant to grant him. But there does seem to be a great deal of momentum behind this right now, maybe in honor of or in memory of the senator.
And we'll see where that goes. I said just one piece of the legacy for Senator Lindsey Graham. Michael Froman, thanks so much. Appreciate you being with us.